Peggy 12.
The goal, or should I say, the dream, is to build a colony. A self-sufficient new world, far away from Earth.
Now, it's not a secret that for the longest time that I've been looking at other games to play on the channel, and it's been a bit of a look-see-roundsy, really, going back and forth between titles such as Tomb Raider or Paradox's own Crusader Kings 2, and then even dabble a little bit with the classics like Alpha Centauri. However, when I was at PDXCon earlier in 2017, they announced Surviving Mars, a colony building game that really ticks all the boxes for me. Now for today's videos, we got a double whammy for this particular title. We're going to be talking not about just one Death Diary, which got released about a week ago. We're going to be talking about two. So we're going to be talking specifically about the vision of the game, as well as the tools and resources that you will have to build your Mars colony. Now first, let's start off with the vision for the game. Considering the developers are Hanemond, they are active in the Tropico series, and they've been working on those for quite some time. They are definitely building something akin to a city builder, but not really your average city builder. Apparently, they are calling this a interconnected experience of systems and testing them out versus the harsh environment of the Red Planet. Now, this by itself is already very fascinating to me because the Red Planet has always been something of a dream come true in terms of the next frontier. We basically, aside from the oceans, we've pretty much discovered everything on the planet, aside from some jungles and mountaintops in the Arctic regions. Still, the quote of wanting to die on Mars, just not on impact, from Elon Musk does ring true in this particular scenario. Now, the vision for the game is very much an old idealistic sci-fi story, kind of like the 1960s approaches of sci-fi a la Tintin, or anything involving giant rockets from something you would see in The Outer Limits or The Day the Earth Stood Still. And that's kind of the artistic and aesthetic direction that they're going in. Very lighthearted and somewhat nostalgic, mixed in with a bunch of very interesting things such as the Mars Interplanetary Launch Vehicle from SpaceX, which by itself is actually really cool, and I'm keeping my eyes on that and the development of that particular type of spacecraft. The science in the game is most likely going to be fairly plausible without diving into minutia, as it is saying here. We've seen some videos already with windmills on Mars, and considering the air pressure on that planet being somewhat marginal, I kind of look at that with a grain of salt. But still, you know, it's not really 100%, and it's not thematically centered around science, but having some scientific stuff going around in the background is actually really important for the developers. So, which is really interesting for me, because when it comes to going to the Red Planet and trying to figure out how to live there, what kind of resources do we need, and building a colony and not really losing too many of our colonists in the process. And this brings us to Death Diary 2, where we're going to be talking a little bit more about the major design goals and resource systems that are going to be available in the game itself. First of all, the three design goals that they had in mind. 1. Resources are very different from one another. There is multiple resources there. There is things like oxygen, things like items that need to be synthesized into different types of chemicals, concrete, resources that are coming in from Earth itself on the interplanetary transporters, and that sort of thing, with a very large amount of resources being available, at least as far as being described. In addition, resources need to feel scarce. It is Mars, after all. It's humanity's first colony, and obviously it's going to take time to even get there. And if additional resources need to be sent out, it's going to take time. The parallel you can pull here is very similar to that of Avatar, where humanity is in a different solar system, so obviously the scope is a little bit different, but if they want to have backup or additional resources, the spaceship needs to be launched from Earth to begin with and then transfer to another area. And considering the transfer windows between Mars and Earth being about 150 days or something along those lines, is going to make life a little bit more interesting in case of a crisis. Time and support from Earth is going to be a problem. Now, in terms of scarcity and resources, apparently you will be able to scan for those new resources on site. Whether or not this is going to be from orbital or not is a whole different question. Apparently, the decision to where to land your first rocket, note how they say your first rocket, and where to expand requires apparently quite significant planning. Finding a rich deposit of some sort of material is important. Failure to secure certain resources is a much bigger problem than in any typical game in the genre. So looking back at games like Tropico, where you're on an island and you get a defined amount of resources, or land with a certain amount of richness where you can build crops or mine for gold or whatnot, on Mars, this is going to be far more difficult because there is no ship that can just pop out or a plane that can just come over and help you out in case of humanitarian crisis. So the end of the colony is definitely something that is potentially possible if you make the wrong mistakes. And the last-ditch effort building vehicles may be salvaged to be reused in their construction resources in order to survive any critical situation. So if you overstretch your scope of your colony, you may be able to scale down a little bit, but obviously then the issue is going to be, are you also going to scale down your population and stuff like that? So far, it does look that the game is very much focused on the survival aspect of building a colony. Kind of what you would expect from the first colonies in the Americas from the Europeans, where in some particular cases it didn't go all that well. Roanoke is one of the historical colonies that comes to mind. Also, finally, as the third option, resources are positional, so they can be anywhere on the map, and transporting those resources from A to B into your processing centers is going to be critical. Whether or not you're going to be using rovers or piping or power lines and stuff like that, drone workers and larger vehicles are specifically mentioned here, are going to be needed to basically bring those resources to where they need to go. Underground tunnels may be required to reach isolated parts of the map, and transportation vehicles usually require resources to perform their function, threatening to shut down your carefully planned systems in case of a power or fuel shortage. So looks like there's going to be a lot of balancing that's going to go on here. If you've played a lot of games like Factorio or anything along those lines, then this should fit fairly well. Now, this is all speculation, obviously. So let's actually take a look at the basic resources here. So the basic resources are going to be metals, concrete, rare metals, and food. Now, those four themselves are fairly straightforward. Metals, you're going to need metals in order to basically build anything. Thankfully, Mars, the red planet, is red because of its iron-based surface, so that's always a fairly big deal. Concrete is more of an interesting one, considering I'm not really familiar with the process of how to create concrete, but certain types of materials are required for it, as well as water. So getting water early on is probably going to be really important in order to build your shelters. Rare metals is kind of a different term. Rare metals by itself is not really a definition of a quote-unquote rare metal, unless they come up with specific materials in the game to make stuff a little bit more interesting. And of course, food, because as The Martian has shown, building potatoes on Mars is kind of a pretty important thing. So automatic extractors can be placed on spots rich in sulfur in the Martian soil, which they can use to dig up sulfur-rich regolith. Now, regolith is a material that also appears on the moon, and then you can mix it up and turn it into concrete. So that's basically the approach they're going to go there. But you have to mix it up probably with water in order to get the proper reactions going on there. Scarce amounts of metals may be gathered directly from meteorite remains. That's a fascinating approach. So all materials are definitely, at least as far as I understand from reading this, going to be placed in a finite scenario. Again, the Factorio reference kind of comes in there, or any other classic building setup, such as, say, Banished, where there's quite a lot of resources and you're trying to survive. So I think that's probably the strongest parallel we can pull so far. Exploiting underground metal deposits is more complex and not fully automated. It requires special buildings staffed by colonists, so you're going to need to have those worked out, and you're going to need to colonize the surface to get, shelter for those colonists, so that's kind of important. Rare metals are scarce. You're going to need those to create electronics, and apparently those electronics, considering they are made on a different planet with different processes and different gravity, are apparently valuable enough to be exported. So there may be also a process of exporting your materials. There is a concept in logistics called deadheading, where if you send a truck from A to B and it's full of materials, but it's completely empty on the way back, then it's called deadheading. There is no reason to send it back empty from a logistical point of view if there's no resources ready to be shipped. So that looks like it's going to be a case here. Obviously, if your colony is not set up for it yet, you're going to be sending back empty spacecrafts quite a lot, which is interesting. Individual resource deposits offer different resource quantities and grades, so looks like you'll need to do a bunch of refining as well. So that's interesting. Deep deposits cannot be exploited or discovered initially, but will become available later in the game. See, they're alluding quite a lot to items later in the game. So whether or not this is more scenario-based or sandbox-based is kind of an interesting question. Obviously, Tropico is, from the same developers, is more of a scenario-based game. So we'll have to see whether or not this kind of ties into a similar realm, or whether or not they're going to go and spread their wings, so to speak. We saw something very similar with the developers of City Skylines, Colossal Order, basically starting out as a traffic simulation, or at least a transport simulation developer with a lot of scenarios in it, and then later on expanding into City Skylines, which is more of a sandbox experience. So maybe Heinemann is taking the plunge, so to speak, into the sandbox environment. Food production on Mars is challenging. I think that is relatively straightforward when it comes to temperature, soil grading, and that sort of thing. Mars is not known to be the most moist of planets, but it looks like it's going to be possible, although I don't want to be one of those first colonists that have to eat the most basics of foodstuffs on the Martian soil. Apparently, the first colonists will have to rely on supplies secured from Earth, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit shortly. And there are many different types of crops that can be grown, as well as fungal farms. Fungal farms. Huh. Interesting. Offering a more exotic food source. So maybe protein coming from fungal farms or anything like that. I don't think meat is going to be on the table anytime soon, considering the intensity of basically requiring materials for that sort of high protein material. Then again, maybe, meat printing will become a thing as well. Then we started looking at advanced resources, stuff like polymers, electronics, machine parts, and of course, fuel. You do want to get more spacecraft at some point, apparently. So it looks like that you're going to be producing your basic materials, which you can then process into more advanced stuff, and I'm sure there's going to be giant spreadsheets with tables showing you exactly what sort of values you need to have for optimizing your resource production. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be interesting. Polymers, electronics, machine parts are made in dedicated factories. That makes perfect sense. You need colonists to operate those. You think they'd be using robotics at some point, especially for machine parts. Heavy machinery is obviously not something that you want to be too close with. Then again, in low grav, that may be problematic as well. A fledgling colony will almost certainly not be able to securely supply of these resources during the early stage of colonizations, and once again, we'll have to rely on shipments from Earth. Then is the third type of resource, which is power, oxygen, and water. Basically, the basic necessities of modern life. Obviously, oxygen and water are more of a basic resource all the way from any sort of Terran point of view. But power itself and electricity, it keeps the world going. Now, well, the thing is, if you've got water, which we know is abundant on Mars, you can put power through it to generate oxygen and hydrogen. So that's also where your fuel will be coming from, and then you can grow crops, etc. So grid resources are distributed through colony using preset infrastructure, such as a power grid or a pipe network. Basically, your average industrial plant. Both pipes or cables are prone to failures. Oh, that's delightful. Surviving Mars. The focus is definitely on the survival. Large networks require regular maintenance by drones. Interesting. So they need people to work the machine factories, but we got drones out on the surface to do all the other stuff, so that's good. Different power sources have their own strengths and weaknesses, such as solar, and then we've got wind, and then other stuff. It doesn't look like we're actually going to be seeing nuclear just yet. It's not really shown on there so far. I'm pretty sure we're going to see nuclear at some point. Uranium is a general resource that is available universe-wide, even though it's relatively rare, being generated, I think, during supernovae or the merger of neutron stars, but the process on that is still not, I don't think it's 100% clear, but I need to look at the documentation for that. Oxygen is produced from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, by the atmospheric carbon dioxide machine called a MOXIE, so that's kind of cool. And emergency supplies should be used basically everywhere where necessary. More advanced and reliable power sources will become available as the game progresses. That's, okay, maybe nuclear is a thing. Or maybe fusion, who knows, as time advances. You are a colony after all. You don't have the power of all the scientists on Earth to bash your heads against that sort of thing. But then again, if anybody figures out how to do that on Earth, you may be able to replicate that on another planet. Then we get to final resources, which is funding your mission. Now, money is obviously a big thing when it comes to colonizing pretty much anything or getting anything done in the modern world, especially when it comes to space flight. Funding the colony measures in millions of dollars. That would normally be billions, by the way. And is only relevant in your dealings with Earth. So you need to generate cash in order to buy stuff from Earth, such as getting additional rockets, vehicles, prefab buildings, that sort of thing. Payload is apparently completely customizable, so you can put stuff in there, and there's a nice screenshot to go with this, so that's kind of cool. Since the rocket will travel for a while, probably somewhere between 4 and 6 months, depending on the transfer window, if my Kerbal Space Program history is correct, but still, we'll take a look at that. And I'm also really interested whether or not the difficulty level increases the cost of per kilo, because yes, per kilo will be a thing by weight. I know there's a lot of Americans watching this, so that's 2.2 pounds in terms of weight, but I'm sure that you can change the value of weight, but metric is pretty good. You should probably take a look at that. Rockets have to be refueled on the return trip, which is where the fuel generation comes in. Maximize benefits from resupply. You have to load useful cargo in on each trip that you will immediately need, and also resources that you may need later on. Which makes perfect sense. You want to use maximum payload capacity on your ships, both on your way in and on the way out. So, and apparently there's going to be multiple ways of having funding, whether or not you're being funded privately from a government, and different requirements coming in, etc. So, next Dev Diary is going to be a month away. Okay, maybe I should have just kept the two separate videos, but fair enough. We're going to be talking about permanent human settlements on the Red Planet. Good old Mars. So, yeah, definitely some really good stuff there. I'm really interested in surviving Mars, and I'm really looking forward to see this game coming out apparently sometime next year. Super exciting stuff. Very exciting stuff. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure this is some of you maybe the first contact with the channel. I know there's a lot of Stellaris content out there, so Surviving Mars is looking to be a solid secondary mainstay on here. So let's nurture this community. If you're new here and you're just thinking by yourself, wow, Surviving Mars looks really cool. Wow. Yeah, it definitely does. Going from grand strategy to surviving on the new frontier. We'll be back with another Dev Diary in about a month's time for Surviving Mars. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take good care of yourselves and, as always, each other.